Good evening and welcome to the decision session executive member for economy and strategic planning, Tuesday the 15th of June. And just going through the agenda. It's been a while since we've had one of these in person, since the 16th of March 2020. Declarations of interest. I don't have any that aren't already on the register of interests. Minutes, item 2, minutes for the meeting held on the June the 27th of April. I am content to sign those, and I believe, Louise, that you've brought all of the other meetings that I have approved the minutes on Zoom, and so I shall physically sign. Okay, thank you for that. Item 3, public participation. We don't have any members of the public registered to speak, although what I will do is acknowledge there was a question in relation to information provided within the papers, and that did result in the annex that was published recently, Annex D. And coming on to item 4, the UK Community Renewal Fund. Tracy Carter, if you could cover the issue of why we haven't been able to provide as much information as we would have done had this been a locally designed scheme.
Certainly will, Councillor Waller. So the report in front of you sets out the process that we have gone through to run a York call for proposals for the UK Community Renewal Fund. This is a £220 million fund, which is a one-year pilot for the new UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which in turn replaces the former EU structural funds, and is expected to be a 1.5 billion per annum fund available from 2023 onwards. But this is as a pilot, and the process for application is through either mayoral combined authorities or through local authorities where those don't exist. So it's not a grant procedure and designed by the council. There's a maximum of £3 million per area available, and this has to be spent by the 31st of March 2022, with final funding decisions being made by government from July onwards. The fund is open to every area, but 100 of those areas have been given priority status and some capacity funding to support their local process of calls for projects. If all of those priority areas should get £3 million of funding, then the whole fund would be oversubscribed by £80 million. And for the 268 other non-priority places, such as York, they've had to put this bidding process together without any additional funding and with, unfortunately, a low probability of securing funding from that process. All of the assessment criteria are defined by government, and the themes are investment in skills, investment for local business, investment in communities and place, and supporting people in employment. We received 15 applications, and they are listed in the supplementary annex. But 6 of those did not meet the defined criteria as set out above. Of those 9 that did meet the criteria, we're submitting them all to government. The question you asked as you began the introduction is that as part of this grant process, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government set out a privacy notice that was published with the proposals, which precludes us from actually revealing the content of those applications. It's a competitive process, and they've constrained us within the GDPR requirements to not be able to confirm anything more than the name of the applicant, the value of the bid, but not the content of the detail of the bid, presumably because that is a competitive process that they want to determine applications for before the detail is published. It's perceived that if we are successful with any of those applications, that the detail of that will be revealed by the applicants when MHCLG make their decision. So I think Community Renewal Fund is also a little bit of a misnomer. The grant assessment criteria, as you'll see from what I revealed earlier, are not particularly about community renewal or tackling social exclusion. We are doing further work on social exclusion, for instance, the 1-year skills plan, the ability to retrain people who have lost their jobs during COVID, the promotion of apprenticeships, the inclusive growth funding, micro grants, the Trader Association funding, and the additional resources grants for small businesses and hardship funds. So there's quite a lot that we've been doing in that particular space. But for this Community Renewal Fund, is dictated by government, the process and the constraints on the revealing of information dictated by government. It's a similar situation for the Levelling Up funding, where the only part of that funding assessment that relates to deprivation is the initial assessment that establishes which tier each authority is in. And as York in that situation is also in the lowest criteria, the lowest tier, our funding, our power to attract funding is going to be somewhat constrained by that. And the current criteria for the Levelling Up funding are more about kind of capital-led economic development and placemaking than they are about the levelling up activity in itself. But what we are finding is that the current government funding rounds are coming forward now with incredibly short turnaround times for submission and for the spend deadlines within it. In order to be successful, we do need to have kind of oven-ready business cases and proposals to take off the shelf to have the best chance of securing external funding, and we are now doing that as part of the Levelling Up funding. We aspire that through the future government funding streams, we will then perhaps have some success in being able to attract additional capital and revenue funding into the city, and that is maybe something that we might want to have a little bit of thought about how we can support community groups in undertaking that same process of getting their bids ready for submission.
Thank you for that, Tracy. I am joined tonight by Councillor Gerald Smalley, Executive Member for Culture, Leisure and Communities. And I'm sure there'll be some questions that you would like to put.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And again, thank you for inviting me today in this consultation role. I guess you've already covered what would have been my first question in terms of how, despite the name, it's not necessarily the most community orientated fund we've ever seen as an administration or as a council. I was going to firstly, I guess, just to touch on the very last bit you said in terms of the timescale and how that process was. I think we've seen it, I guess, elsewhere in my portfolio in the capital funding rounds that have come out, whether it's Arts Council or Heritage Lottery Fund, really short timescales, which risks building back better turning into sort of building back botched as organisations scramble to submit bids. I guess in the sort of broader sense, given that the Community Renewal Fund is in a sense a pilot of the Shared Prosperity Fund, how have, I guess, officers and the council partners found this process? For example, I guess in comparison to the processes around ERDF and ESIF Fund.
I think the short window that we had to get a scheme together, the limitations on what we could and couldn't decide within it, or how much influence we had within that, and the really limited time for us to work with applicants to shape a bid that was most likely to be successful, have clearly had an impact, having received a number of bids that just failed to meet the basic eligibility criteria. If we'd had longer, we could have worked with those organisations to get those shaped to try and hit the target a bit more accurately. And potentially to enable them to then to work together on something that might have been a more kind of cohesive and convincing bid. So I think the timescales are just ridiculously tight, very hard for us to hit, even with our dedicated resources, and even more difficult for community groups to hit that don't necessarily have the kind of dedicated time or skill set for something like that. I think there is an opportunity for us to try and share a little bit of our expertise. That's going to be fairly thinly spread at the council, but if we were able to help working with them to identify target bids that are then ready for when we get those future funding rounds and bigger pots, and hopefully better time windows to be able to both apply for and spend the money.
Thank you for that, Tracy. I just have a few questions myself, and you've touched on what could happen with officers working with applicants for future funding opportunities. I hope that's feasible within the capacity of the team that's working on that. And I think to overcome some of the concerns that have been expressed on understanding what these schemes are about, I'm happy to visit all of the establishments and organisations to find out more, and there's nothing to stop them talking about their schemes, because there will be other bids, as you've mentioned, and I think it is important to ensure that we're all aware of what capacity there is to respond to the amount of people looking for work, looking to change their career structures, and also the most recent figures are that there's still over 11,000 people on furlough within the city. So that's something to really get in shape. So I think it is important that we do have these effectively oven ready. It seems a phrase that's not been that well used in the past, but I think we know what it means. And it's helpful, particularly with the partnership working on the skills board, that people are more aware of what other sectors are doing, the opportunities that there, and there is much more a sense of the York way of doing things, which is more collaborative, but recognising that when the government is calling the tune with the central government funding pots, they do need to be in a shape, but sometimes you do not have many weeks in which to turn that around. So the advance work that can be done to enhance the return on investment figure, and understanding what these will do. And some didn't reach this particular application process because of capital, but equally there are other, I'm conscious of over the years there have been schemes that demand, it must be capital, it can't be revenue, and therefore there will be applicability there. So I appreciate the amount of time that's gone into turning this around so quickly. I'm conscious of different authorities have not had public meetings like this to talk about the process. So just recognising where we are, except that there were 15 applications. There's been a review with the York and North Yorkshire head of strategy, head of corporate policy and city partnerships, and head of economic growth, to look through how do they fit. We're not ranking the 9 that are going forward. That is really for the government to put through their process, but we recognise that on this particular scheme we're ranked as an authority relatively lowly, but that's not to say that they are not good schemes and that they might not be applicable to future applications. So I'm happy to accept the recommendations as printed, with an additional 2, and I'll just confirm with Tracy that these would work with officers, that I request that officers, in addition to the recommendations, I request that officers prepare an update on the utilisation of the Inclusive Growth Fund and development of the skills strategy, which is work that's in progress, but I think it is worth addressing that in terms of the inclusion, tackling social isolation, and the skills gap. And that secondly, additionally, that I request that officers to develop a York local strategy to develop a pipeline of projects with partners to support the economic recovery amongst those hardest hit by COVID, as part of the consultation on the economic strategy. That's an ongoing process, but it's about having those project applications ready for whenever the time is appropriate and there's new funding available. Tracy, are those feasible within the resources of your team?
Yes, I think we were intending to bring an update on the inclusive growth and the skills strategy anyway, so that's already kind of on our forward horizon, and at the provision of a bit of support to potential bidders for future funding applications, I think will be a really important part of our future economic strategy, identifying a list of target activities that we want to see happening and then seizing on the opportunities as for the funding as it comes through is a clear, it clearly makes sense in terms of the utilisation of our resources to support that activity.
Thank you for that. So with those two additional recommendations, I approve item 4, which brings us on to item 5, urgent business. Now, I do have some urgent business. I consider that the Local Government Act 1972 does allow me to ask Tracy Carter in relation to the Prime Minister's announcements last night on the 4-week delay in the phase 4 of the roadmap, work that needs to be done by the authority to support businesses, because that will be very relevant to a large number that will not be able to open fully or will not be able to open at all. Thank you.
So you remember from the last executive report when we talked about the additional restrictions grant that's in place. We were giving a limited amount of funding last year to support businesses during lockdown, and we managed to share that with businesses very fast, and we've done a piece of research into the impact of some of the micro grants activity we also undertook with our own money to support businesses, which has been very, very positive, which is going to be to the executive later this month. Future rounds of additional restriction grant were also then announced by government, and a further potentially £1.8 million is expected. We've yet to have that confirmed in the final total, and we expect to be in receipt of that funding from the 23rd of June. If that funding comes through at that level, then we can further commit to support those businesses that are eligible for that grant support for the remainder of the roadmap as currently identified. And we also believe that there will be some remaining available funding from the additional restrictions grant that could support us in further activity to support those sectors that have been most damaged and most hurt, and now will have lost a larger element of their summer trading that normally sees them through some of the fallower months of October, November, January, February, when businesses are traditionally a little quieter in York. So we have a number of festivals that occur within the city as a regular event. Those are at the moment facing some duress and some stress. The uncertainty of trading, the ability to trade, and the financial outlay required to make those events happening, things like the food festival, the ice festival, event to support Halloween, and we would like to be able to bring you a further request for some support funding to ensure that those activities happen in the city, and we'll be including that in the report that's going to come to you, to the executive, in June. It will be conditional upon receipt of additional restrictions grant from government, but it's still a commitment to make sure that we as a city support our events businesses through what's been a very, very trying time and continues to be difficult for them.
Thank you for that update, and I look forward to seeing the additional work within the report coming to executive. That item closed, I bring the meeting to an end.